here at Penn Station in downtown Pittsburgh, and it's noon. Well, you can't tell that because the clock's broken, but take my word for it, it's noon. Which means it's 11 a.m. in Chicago, 10 a.m. in Denver, and only 9 a.m. in Seattle. Time zones are something that we all understand and we all take for granted, but when time zones came into being, it was a rather contentious issue. And here in Pittsburgh, it was an especially confusing process, in no small part due to this station and this clock. I'm Knowles, I'm here to explore and explain. So as I said, it's noon here in Pittsburgh, Eastern Standard Time. But 150 years ago, there was no such thing as Standard Time. There was only Solar Time. Now, since the beginning of civilization, people have been devising ways to keep track of time. One of the easiest ways to do that is to measure when the sun is at its highest point in the sky and divide it out from there. You have the angle of the shadows, and you take that, you use that to create hours. Think of a sundial. Basing time off of shadows and the sun is called apparent solar time. By the Middle Ages, each village would have a clock or a clock tower, bell tower of their own that would be based off of this apparent solar time, but it'd be averaged out a little bit to be more regular. That was called mean solar time. Now, this sun-based method works really well when you're part of a tribe or a group that occupies a specific area. When your entire life is based on your farm or maybe your village, you don't need to know the time anywhere else. Your little valley is all you need. But then when your society becomes transcontinental or transoceanic, you kind of need to know where the time is at multiple places at once. And when a technology comes along, such as the railroad that allows people to travel faster than ever before, suddenly local time isn't going to cut it anymore. Now, the railroads, as I mentioned, felt this problem more acutely than just about anybody else. By the time of the Civil War, railroads had grown to cover huge swaths of territory, and they based their timetables off of the city that they were headquartered in. So the Pennsylvania Railroad, for example, based all of its timetables off of local Philadelphia time, even though the tracks stretched all the way to Chicago. So say a train was traveling between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and another train was traveling between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, right? One in each direction. This is a trip that used to take days, but now takes hours. If the engineers are not able to properly calculate the difference between Pittsburgh local time and Cleveland local time, and the timetables of whatever railroads that would be connecting the two, there's probably going to be a disaster, and that actually happened a lot throughout the 1800s. Trains would crash into each other simply because there was a miscalculation in time. People were using different systems. Now, I'm skipping ahead a little bit here just to kind of drive this point home, but somebody posed the question at the General Time Convention in 1883, spoiler alert, whom do you hold responsible for rear-end collisions at stations? The train standing at the station or the train approaching it? No one wants to be liable for something like that. At risk of sounding maybe too cynical here, we can't count out railroads' liability concerns as a reason that we have our modern system of timekeeping. So what the railroads wanted was a way to be sure that their entire system could be synchronized. With the advent of the telegraph and other related machinery, it was possible to distribute a pulse across a huge distance and automatically set multiple clocks at once. One of the first places to offer this service was the Allegheny Observatory here in Pittsburgh, technically Allegheny City at the time. By using a small telescope and a strand of spider silk, astronomers could observe the time by tracking a few certain stars as they crossed over the plane of that spider silk. And they actually pioneered the subscription model by allowing anyone who wanted the time each day to pay a $1 a month fee. Their major customers were the city of Pittsburgh, the county of Allegheny, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. The observatory actually turned a profit from hosting this service and kept doing it until 1946. But even with each railroad having its own time, there were still at least 80 city time zones and hundreds of other local time zones across the country by 1883. For instance, if it was noon here in Pittsburgh, it would be 11:47 in Columbus, and it would be 12:10 in Altoona. So finally, after years of people throwing out good ideas and nothing being done, the railroads all got together in 1883 and held the General Time Convention, which might be the most sci-fi sounding thing to have ever happened in the 19th century. Some people said there should be a national time zone based on Washington, D.C. Others said New York should be the standard. Some people said we should do it right down the middle of the country in Kansas, but other people said nobody lives there, why would we do that? Finally, they decided that all railroads that signed on to this agreement, and that really only left out a few stragglers, would follow a new system wherein the US and Canada would be divided into 5 zones of roughly 15 degrees each, and that going westward, each zone would be an hour behind the previous one. This was a pretty radical concept at the time, even though we think of this as just the way things are today. And the date given to enact this time change, this radical new concept of timekeeping, which was meant only for the railroads at first and telegraph companies, was November 18th, 1883. But having heard about this plan, most major cities in the country thought it would be much easier if they just signed on to it as well. Within 1 year, 85% of all cities with over 10,000 people were using this new system, Standard Time. It wasn't until 1918, however, that the Congress passed the Standard Time Act, making Standard Time the law of the land, and that was due to fuel shortages during World War I and the need to conserve daylight. So the day of two noons is November 18th, 1883, when the railroads decided that Standard Time should go into effect. All around the country, citizens gathered in front of tower clocks or station clocks and watched the hands stop for up to a half an hour until the new noon came. Here's an article reprinted from the New York Times that I think really captures the zeitgeist of this day. Curious people, some of whom could not exactly understand how the time could be changed without some serious results, crowded the sidewalk in front of jewelry stores and watch repair establishments to see the great transformation. There was a universal expression of disgust when it was discovered that all that was necessary to change the time was to stop the clock for 4 minutes and then start it again. A large crowd gathered in the vicinity of the city hall to watch the change as indicated on the faces of the clock which rests under the shadow of the restored Cypriot antique of justice. "Begorra," remarked to his companion a vermilion-topped Hibernian man who was watching the south face of the clock. "The thing has stopped. What's the matter with it anyhow? I don't see no time changin', do you, Mike?" "Divil a change at all, can I see," said his companion, who turned away with apparent disgust after watching the motionless hand for a minute or two. "Lave us go on, the whole thing's a sell." "Hold your whist, will ye?" said the first speaker, who gazed fixedly at the clock. "She's moving again. Watch it now." The two gazed steadily at the clock and saw the minute hand again start on its course. They started for Park Row, and one sadly remarked to the other, "I told yer 'twas a sell. The clock's running again, and there's been nary a change of time at all. At all." Now, some people weren't too happy with this change. Here's an article from Indianapolis at the same time. "Railroad time is the time of the future. The sun is no longer the boss on the job. People, all 55 million of them, must eat, sleep, and work as well as travel by the railroad time. It is a revolt, a rebellion. The sun will be requested to rise and set by railroad time. The planets must in the future make their circuits by such timetables as railroad magnates arrange. People will have to marry by railroad time and die by railroad time. Ministers will be required to preach by railroad time. Banks will open and close by railroad time. In fact, the Railroad Convention has taken charge of the time business, and the people may as well set about adjusting their affairs in accordance with its decree. We presume the sun, moon, and stars will make an attempt to ignore the orders of the Railroad Convention, but they too will have to give in at last." So now I get a chance, or maybe a second chance, to make this about Pittsburgh. The map that I had on screen, did you notice anything about it? Central Time is huge compared to what the time zones look like today. Central Time stretched all the way from New Mexico and North Dakota in the west to Florida and Pennsylvania in the east. And not just any place in Pennsylvania either, the forks of the Ohio. Pittsburgh was split down the middle into two time zones. And I'm going to back up here a little bit to explain why that is. The Pennsylvania Railroad's main line from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh was the bona fide Pennsylvania Railroad, but everything west of Pittsburgh was technically a bunch of subsidiary companies under their control, but not technically the Pennsylvania Railroad. These were collectively called the Lines West, and they had their own internal governance structures, they had their own timetables, they had their own rolling stock, etc., etc. It was, for all intents and purposes, a different railroad. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad would have preferred that their entire system remain under the same standard time as had been the case before 1883, but seeing as their system ran from New York City to Chicago and St. Louis, they realized this was probably a little impractical. So they thought, if there's going to be a dividing line somewhere, we want it to be in Pittsburgh because we already have a natural break occurring there. Now, because the Pennsylvania Railroad was the most powerful railroad in the world, they imposed their demands on the convention, and the line between Eastern and Central Time went right through Pittsburgh. All of the border counties except Greene were in Central Time, along with Allegheny City and the South Side. Pennsylvania Station, at the northern end of downtown, was Eastern Time, and the Fort Wayne Station in the north side was on Central Time. There were 9/10 of a mile between these stations. If a Pennsylvania Railroad train was leaving on the Panhandle route, it crossed the Panhandle Bridge over the Mon River. If it turned to the left, it stayed in Eastern Time. If it turned to the right, it went to Central Time. The PNLE Railroad, operating out of what is now Station Square, ran on Central Time. And to make this problem all the more confusing, the city was one of those 15% of cities that didn't immediately adopt Standard Time. They didn't sign on to the General Time Convention until around 1900. So as Ken Kobus lays out in his article on this, If someone entered Pittsburgh on a train, they would have to coordinate 3 different times. 1, they would have to check their own watch against Pittsburgh local time, which was 20 minutes later than Eastern time and 40 minutes ahead of Central time. Then they would cross-reference this against the railroad standard time. Then 3, they'd adjust 1 hour forward or backwards depending on the direction of travel. If your train was heading westward, its schedule would be in Central time, but if it was heading eastward, its schedule was in Eastern time. This made things easy for the Pennsylvania Railroad, but not so much for the average passenger without a math degree. With the passage of the Standard Time Act in 1918, the time zone boundary was moved from Pittsburgh to its present-day boundary in western Indiana, just east of Chicago. Thus faded into history one of Pittsburgh's more confounding chapters. Well, that's all I've got for you today. I really hope you liked the video. I learned a lot while doing the research on this, and I hope you learned a lot while watching it. If you liked it, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like and a comment, all that stuff. And I'll see you another time.